You like the microphone?
So, when hello everyone. So one of the things I've been talking about with my wife is that I guess it's an extension of something I used to do in my clinical practice. You know, if you're dealing with people who are depressed, one of the things you can do with them is you can have them track their mood variation, hour by hour even. Because someone who's depressed will tell you that they're depressed all the time. And perhaps they are, but sometimes they're somewhat less depressed than other times. There's still variability. Now, it might be the variability of suffering in hell, but it's still variability. And what that means is that you can help the person delineate when they're suffering most and least intensely, right? And then you can start to triangulate on that, right? You might think, okay, well, when things are really bad for you, when is that exactly? Does that repeat? Is it the morning? And what's the context? And then you can do an analysis of what deepens suffering, and then you can do the reverse, which is, when is it that you're least miserable? And then the next step is, well, maybe you could rearrange yourself so that you're doing the things that make you most miserable less of the time, and you can see a progression. Now, you could phrase that positively. So you could imagine that you were watching your marriage like you didn't understand it, which you don't. And you could see your marriage and your family, let's say, you could see that now and then that the light would be shining through, right? That for whatever reason, now, under these circumstances, we're playing with each other, everyone's pleased to be here, we're concentrating on the moment, our experience is suffused with joy, grace is descended, we're doing something to allow that to happen. What is it, and could we learn to live there more often? Okay, so you're pointing in that direction with regards to the emergence of eternity into life. Right? So then you could imagine that you could practice that, and people can do that. So it might be that you find that in your typical day you're only spending 10 minutes in that state, but if you practice diligently for 6 months, you could get it up to like half an hour, and then within that half an hour, you'd see that there'd be a new seed that would be emerging, that would be a higher order of bliss even within that. And that can be continually, that's the pearl of great price, by the way. That's the mustard seed, that's the kingdom of heaven. Those are all the same things. Okay, so I understand, and I also like your emphasis, the emphasis you place on the idea that that's something that has to be made manifest here, and that we can't throw away the world of reality in favor of some heaven after death that's displaced. And you can understand why that's a danger too, because the world becomes a place to escape from and can become denigrated, and our identities become something that float above it, which is exactly where we're at in a kind of postmodern transhumanist world. Okay, so that's my understanding of what you've said. Now, what I don't understand, and this is a terribly unfair question, but I'd like to know what your thoughts are. Well, I guess the issue still is, what of the dead? Right? Because it's all well and good to be digging for the kingdom of heaven while you're alive, but it's a lot harder when you're dead. And so, what I saw you doing today was wrestling with the problem of the relationship between eternity and heaven and the proximal, and making a case that we can't abandon the proximal in the least. We need to elevate it to the status of the eternal, but it still leaves us with the problem of death. And so, well, so that's the question. How do you reconcile, because by scrapping that kind of unconscious traditional view of heaven and hell as what happens after you die, you also scrap the problem of how to address the fact of the loss of death. And so I'm wondering where your thoughts have taken you in that regard.
Yeah. So
And this is obviously based on the tradition I'm in, have received. But so the Russian folktale, you see a piece of that, right? So the way this has been traditionally phrased is a person can't repent, they can't take action to change and transform their life once they're dead for themselves. But the community of which they were a part can come and intercede for them. And what I think that Russian folktale brings out is that what's happening there is not sort of, oh, we're all begging God to change his mind about this person, right, and decide they were a good person instead of a bad person. But what we are doing is we're trying to bring to the fore those moments in that time. Because I think what we mean by the resurrection of the dead on the last day is us coming back to inhabit not just this body in some sense, this physical body, this physical world in some sense, but to re-inhabit our lives. But our lives now purified of everything that was pain and suffering, and only those moments remain, and we live those moments.
Okay, we sort of do that. We sort of do that. Well, we sort of do that when we pull the spirit of great people along with us from the past, right? I mean, I was sitting here thinking about what you were talking about, and I'm working with this employee of mine now. We're building large language models, and we're thinking about resurrecting people essentially. And so, because you can build a large language model of Nietzsche, for example, and now you can more or less embody that. So we could build a large language model of Nietzsche and provide him with a photorealistic avatar and have him lecture again. And that is, I mean, we'd already do that with the great people of the past to some degree, because we pull them along and we pull out their best and we carry that with us, right? And that is something like you could imagine that in principle being something like the separating of the wheat from the chaff and the conserving of the wheat and the bringing that along with us. But the woman that you talked about, for example, her life was almost all chaff. So and that's a terrible thing to think about in relationship to your own life, by the way.
Yeah, it is.
It's the most terrible thing to think about, in fact, virtually by definition. Does that mean that if your life is all chaff, that you remain eternally dead?
That is what I think is meant by eternal death, where that phrase is used in the scriptures. And that's a horrible, yeah. Well, and one of the key elements, though, of the scriptures and of the Christian tradition is, with maybe a couple exceptions like Judas and maybe Arius, there's no one that it is said that has happened to. But it is out there continually as a possibility for us.
I mean, that death.
Yes, that is a possibility. Not for other people, but for me. Right? And that spurs me to continue to examine my life.
Yeah.
To continue to say, that possibility being out there, that possibility being extended. Right? So whether there is anyone who will ultimately face that is sort of irrelevant to the question of the work that idea is doing within the scriptures and within the Christian tradition.
Well,
being that possibility.
Well, in some ways, you might want that to happen, because even with regards to Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return, I suppose hell might be the eternal return of everything you did that was stupid in your life being repeated forever. That is hell in your own life, by the way. That's actually why you should solve the problems that present themselves to you, because if you don't, all you do is repeat them. That's why you need to have it out with people, because otherwise you just do the same stupid thing forever, and it gets worse as you do it. That seems to be not the sort of thing you want to preserve. And so, that would mean in some ways that what you would probably pray for is to be submitted to the flaming swords that turn every which way, right? But the terrifying part of that, I suppose, would be that most of you would go.
Yeah, so, that the person who would truly be that far gone would not.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking that the degree to which the flaming swords that turn every which way are hell is proportionate to how much of you would have to be destroyed to pass through them to get to paradise. Right. And I don't know if that's a literal vision of hell. Right? Because if you're 99% dead wood, the flames that purify would be experienced. Would they be experienced as hell? They would be if you experienced that without voluntary compliance. I mean, that happens to you in your life all the time. So, right.
Yeah, and when I sit with people as they're dying, which is a priest you do, the worry and the despair of the family is that all of the love and all of the joy and all of the good is what is dying. That's what's going away. And the hope that Christianity presents is, no, that is what becomes eternal. It's the rest that dies.
Well, that would be the case.
That dies away and is gone.
I suppose if the world was overwhelmed by hell, then it would be the catastrophe that would be eternal, right? That would mean that the wrong, we conserved the wrong thing. Well, I'm wondering, I'm still trying to wrestle with this issue of the dead, let's say.
Yeah.
I mean, you make the case for the embodiment, for the resurrection of the body very powerfully. I mean, one of the things our culture is very perverse about is the notion that identity is something that floats above embodiment in a manner that should be disembodied, and that is, which is why we insist that you can define your own identity, which Nietzsche had something to do with, right? Because he said we should formulate our own values, that we'd have to come to the point where we formulated our own. That was a very bad idea. That was a very bad idea. And I think the psychoanalysts actually corrected that pretty rapidly, although that's not particularly well known. We would hope we would winnow the good and pull it along with us, right? And that we would build the world on the basis of that good. And that would be something like building the world on the foundation of Christ. It's the same idea fundamentally, right? Is that if that's the good that's at the foundation, and then that makes itself manifest in the particularities of each person's time and place, then we pull all that, gather all that as we move along, and that spirit suffuses us, and that's the movement towards eternity. But then I'm still struggling with that. I see that that's true, but I'm still struggling with that in the notion of an embodied resurrection. So I know you can't answer that, because I don't think anybody can answer that. I think we understand.
Right. It's a way of thinking.
Well, it's also something we're stumbling towards the realization of, right?
Yeah.
So, but, okay, so when you're sitting with people dying and they're worried that the good will disappear, what is it that you find to comfort people in those moments?
I think it is precisely this idea that not only are those moments not dying, not only is that love you shared not dying, but that is going to become your reality. That is going to become your reality eternally. And I think in terms of drawing the dead with us, I think that's part of the function of saints in the church. Right? The church is not just Christ, it's also the communion of saints. Right? It's the communion of saints who are saints because of their whole life. Right? We read the lives of the saints, their actual stories played out in time as their identity. Right? And their spirits, the spirits of the righteous made perfect, as we call them, right, are now continually part of and foundational to the community.
Well, you could imagine too that if you're evaluating your life and you see those moments when you exist in something that's at least closer to paradise than your normative existence, that it is during those times that the spirit of what was best in the past is making itself manifest in the present in your life. That is what's happening. I mean, those are the times where your existence is configured and things come together so that the spirit of the eternal redeeming spirit of your ancestors is making itself manifest within you. That's what's happening. And you can invite that in. You know, in the story of Cain and Abel, when Cain is bitter, Cain invites the predatory spirit that crouches on, the predatory spirit of resentment that crouches on his doorstep. He invites that in to take possession of it. That's the accusation that God levels against Cain when Cain shakes his fist at the cosmos. And people do that when the world reveals itself to you in love. That's an indication that for whatever reason, you were fortunate enough to be wise enough to invite in the spirit of what's good to possess you, right? And you can learn to do that, right? And that's really, I would say, that's the Christian journey fundamentally, to do that. And that is something like a conservation of the good of the past. You can see that too, even if you're able to do that in part because maybe you have a wonderful moment with your son, let's say, when he's a child. If you think that through, you understand that that's the moment in which the best of your father shines through you, right? And that best of him was an amalgam of what was best about fathers since time immemorial. I mean, literally, because we imitate each other as we move down the generations and the centuries. And that is the emergence of something eternal into the space of the proximal.
And the saints maintain their identity. It's not just their writings, their thoughts, what they did, but we read their lives, right? Their identity.
Right. Yeah, well, that's the other thing about the insistence of the resurrection of the body that's so brilliant, because if you abandon the notion of the body, you abandon the value of the particularities of time and space, right? It means that only what's abstract about you is real. And that's not, well, that leads to this transhuman postmodernism. It's another pathway there. It has to be that the particularities are just as important as the universalities. And I think that has something to do with Jonathan's constant insistence that you have to understand the reflection of the kingdom of heaven not as something that's merely at the pinnacle or that's the foundation, but that's the pinnacle and the foundation, and that suffuses the whole simultaneously. Right? And so you don't get to abandon the particularities in preference to the general, or vice versa. Right? I suppose vice versa is kind of what the hedonists do. It's only about the embodiment in the present. Right? Okay. Well, that's... thank you. Yeah,